The Pacifica Plan, a constitution nobody ratified, written for a country that doesn't exist, and somehow still winning. In defense of the guy with the version numbers. Let's start by giving the devil his due, because everyone else online already gave him a restraining order. Somewhere out there is a document calling itself the Draft Constitution of Pacifica and Sovereign Persons, Reverend B 000.01.001.2.6, if you're keeping track, and someone clearly is, alongside a companion, New Declaration of Independence, authored under the names, Ghost Liberty, and a chorus of ghost annons. It has articles, it has sections, it has a re-ratification clause that fires every 24 years like a cosmic alarm clock nobody will be alive to hear. It caps the bite size of future federal statutes, which is either the single most based idea in the history of legislative drafting or proof that somebody once got really mad at a 4,000-page appropriations bill and never fully recovered. It was hosted on WordPress. It got banned. The document itself notes this, parenthetically, like a shrug, auto-banned. Naturally, the reflex is to laugh. And you should. Some of it is objectively very funny, in the specific way that only a document written by people who have clearly never had to reconcile a budget can be funny. But before piling on, it's worth asking an uncomfortable question. Compared to what, exactly? Compared to the constitutions that did get ratified. Sure, those have working courts and standing armies, which is nice, but have you read the ones humans actually settled for? A document that took a slavery compromise, called it 3/5 of a person, and left it to future generations to clean up isn't exactly a monument to careful drafting either, it just had the advantage of guns behind it. Institutional legitimacy, in the end, is mostly just fan fiction that won. Pacifica is fan fiction that lost. The literary difference between the two is smaller than the world's flag manufacturers would like you to believe. So, some sympathy for the devil. Not because the document is right, it is, structurally, an absolute disaster, a Frankenstein's monster stitched together out of Jefferson quotes, bracketed alternate readings, and a definition of person, so expansive it includes anything from biologic to warp-up logic, life forms, which is either visionary xenopolitical inclusivity or someone who really needed an editor. But there's something almost admirable about writing an entire government from scratch with zero institutional backing, the way there's something admirable about building a full-scale replica of a battleship in your backyard out of driftwood. It will never sail. It will also never sink, because it was never launched, and unlaunched things are remarkably hard to kill. 2. The status quo's dirty secret. It's also fan fiction, just with better production values. Here's the part that should make everyone squirm equally. The real institutions Pacifica is reacting against are not, structurally, doing anything more sophisticated. They're running on documents too. The only difference is that their documents come with armed enforcement, a 200-year head start on brand recognition, and a much better publicist. Consider the sales pitch. The U.S. Constitution opens with, "We the people," 4 words that get recited with the reverence usually reserved for scripture, despite the fact that the people in question at ratification excluded most of the actual population living under it. Pacifica's preamble opens with roughly the same move, "We the individuals and people of our several states of Pacifica," except it does it in a run-on sentence so long and cluttered with /separated synonyms, liberty, freedom and autonomy, independence, association, property, and contract, that it reads like someone drafting legal text while simultaneously fighting with a thesaurus app that wouldn't let them delete anything. That's a real difference. It's a difference of editing, not of legitimacy. Both documents are, at bottom, a small group of people asserting that their vision of governance deserves to bind everyone else. One group had canons, the other had a WordPress account. Guess which one got taken more seriously by history, and ask yourself honestly whether, had canons, is actually the compelling counterargument you want it to be. This is the devil's advocate case in full. Institutions like to present themselves as the sober, load-bearing alternative to fringe manifestos, but a huge amount of what keeps institutions running is just as performative, just as reliant on people collectively agreeing to pretend the text means something. Nobody has personally consented to the tax code. Nobody read all 6 times the statute volume of federal regulations before being bound by them, a fact Pacifica's drafters were apparently so incensed by that they wrote an entire byte cap article about it. Section 4. Capping regulations at 6 times statute volume and requiring 1-for-1 repeal for any new law, measured in bytes of text. Is that proposal insane as actual governance? Yes, obviously, spectacularly, in the way that any system trying to regulate legislative complexity by file size is insane. But as a satire of how bloated and unaccountable real legislative output has become, it's not nothing. It's a joke with a thesis. The thesis is bad. The observation underneath it is not. 3. The comedy of the wish list. Let's also just enjoy this for a second, because comedic sarcasm was requested and comedic sarcasm shall be delivered. The Pacifica Constitution wants, among other things, post-scarcity insofar as reasonably and humanly possible, which is doing an enormous amount of load-bearing work in that sentence: the abolition of arbitrary power, the deconstruction and overthrow of unjust systems, protection for animals, respect for privacy, an economy generous enough to satisfy everyone's Maslowian needs, and a legislature constitutionally forbidden from passing more laws per year than a jury can read in 2 years, with jurors empowered to summarily strike down anything they consider excessive homework. This is, essentially, a constitution written by someone who has had a genuinely bad time with a DMV, a landlord, and possibly jury duty itself, and decided the correct response was to design an entire civilization around never having that experience again. Admirable ambition. Deeply, deeply unserious as policy. Both things can be true, and the document seems only vaguely aware of this tension, which is part of its charm. Then there's the declaration side, which trades constitutional cosplay for something closer to a group chat that got extremely heated around 2 a.m. It invokes the right to bear arms, from armors to defensive tools including weapons, as inseparable from Americans' freedom to secure and defend ourselves. Grammar, like taxation, is apparently something the sovereign individual has opted out of, rails against wage slavery and neo-feudalism, refuses to recognize the legitimacy of propagandistic educational systems, and closes with a direct address to the willing servants and puppets of the New World Order, warning them that neither the stroke of a pen, nor the muzzle of gun, can erase natural rights, which is true in the same trivial sense that the muzzle of a gun also can't erase your library fines, but can certainly still ruin your Tuesday. It's worth being blunt about this part rather than winking at it. Some of the document's rhetoric about resisting unjust authority, by any means necessary and sufficient, framed alongside grievances about gun regulation, sits in a genuinely dangerous tradition of sovereign citizen and anti-government rhetoric that has, in the real world, ended in real violence. That's not a punchline. Everything else here can get the sarcasm, that part gets a flat, unamused note instead. Devil's advocate has limits, and armed insurrectionist rhetoric is past them. But set that aside for a moment and look at the surrounding absurdity on its own terms, because it is genuinely funny in a way the document itself never seems to notice. An anonymous internet collective calling itself Ghostannons, founding what it describes as Operation Greenway, the Cascadia Plan for 2028 CE, and the Pacifica Plan of Project 2033, all under a single signature. Ghost Liberty, the original Nightslayer, is not a phrase that should appear in the same sentence as founding document of a sovereign nation, and yet here we are, and the sheer confidence of it is almost inspiring. Somewhere in a discourse dominated by institutions too cautious to admit they're improvising, there is at least one guy who named himself Nightslayer and then went ahead and wrote a judiciary article anyway. IV. Now laugh at the other side, because it's earned it too. Fair's fair. If Pacifica gets mocked for writing a government with no country, the status quo deserves equal mockery for running a country with a government most of its citizens can't fully explain. Ask an average adult to describe how a bill actually becomes a law and watch the confidence drain out of the room somewhere around conference committee. Ask them to name what's actually in the 6x statute volume of federal regulations Pacifica's drafters were so mad about, and you'll get silence, because nobody has read it, including, in all likelihood, most of the people who voted to create it. The real system runs on something eerily similar to what Pacifica is accused of: vibes, borrowed authority, and a founding text everyone cites reverently and almost nobody has actually reread cover to cover since a mandatory high school assignment. At least Pacifica's authors admit, openly, in a closing note, that this document is now superfluous, and that only micropatches remain to be discovered. Try getting Congress to append that kind of honesty to anything. And the institutional response to fringe documents like this is, itself, comedy gold. Get banned from a hosting platform, and rather than dying, the document simply notes its own execution in a parenthetical and keeps circulating anyway, which is a more effective form of civil disobedience than most sanctioned protest achieves. The state, or in this case, a mid-tier blogging platform doing its best impression of one, flexed its only available muscle, content moderation, and the document responded the way a cartoon anvil responds to being dropped on a cartoon character, with mild inconvenience and a brief pause before continuing exactly as before. If that's not at least a little bit funny at the expense of institutional power, nothing is. Two kinds of absurd, one kind of permanent. Here's where the devil's advocacy earns its keep. Both sides are absurd, but they're absurd in ways that produce wildly different kinds of permanence, and understanding why requires taking both jokes seriously enough to see what's underneath them. The status quo's absurdity is the absurdity of scale without comprehension, a genuinely enormous body of law that governs billions of interactions daily, running largely on inertia, precedent, and the fact that changing it is expensive enough that most people don't bother trying. Its permanence comes from enforcement, not persuasion. You don't have to find the tax code compelling for it to apply to you. That's a very durable kind of power and a very fragile kind of legitimacy. Since the moment enforcement falters, so does compliance, and there is startlingly little sentimental attachment left over once the men with badges stop showing up. Pacifica's absurdity is the opposite: total persuasive freedom and zero enforcement capacity. It can promise post-scarcity because it will never have to deliver a budget. It can cap legislative complexity by byte count because it will never have to actually govern a healthcare system. Its permanence, such as it is, comes entirely from being interesting enough to keep getting linked, quoted, and mocked, this essay being Exhibit 1000 and something in that ongoing project. That's a weaker kind of power in every practical sense and, ironically, a much stickier kind of legitimacy in the only currency the internet actually trades in: attention. Search engines don't enforce anything. They just remember. And a phrase as specific as the manumit in autonomy, independence of self, is, whether its author intended this or not, extremely easy to find again in 20 years, in a way that paragraph 14b(3) of a regulatory appendix simply is not. So if you're betting on which one gets forgotten first, don't bet on the Fringe Manifesto just because it looks silly. Silly things with distinctive vocabulary and a persecution complex are, perversely, some of the best preserved objects on the internet, precisely because they generate reactions, mockery, analysis, alarm, imitation, and every reaction is a free backup copy nobody asked the author's permission to make. The relic clause, sarcastically appraised. So, does Pacifica become a relic of a pre-dystopian past, a quaint artifact from back when people still thought they could write their way out of institutions with a sufficiently ambitious PDF? Maybe. Let's actually entertain it, devil's advocate style, instead of dodging behind the usual disclaimers about how nobody can predict the future, which is true, but also exactly the kind of hedge a document like Pacifica would sneer at as institutional cowardice, and it would have a small point. If the sweeping changes trend toward more automated, less accountable governance, decisions made by opaque systems nobody elected and few can meaningfully appeal, then Pacifica's core complaint that ordinary people have no real recourse against distant, unaccountable authority stops sounding like fringe paranoia and starts sounding like an early, badly drafted press release for a problem that hadn't fully arrived yet. Its solutions would still be laughably inadequate. A byte cap on statutes does nothing whatsoever against an algorithm that was never written down as a statute in the first place, which is the kind of gap that makes you wonder whether the drafters were fighting the government they had or the government from 40 years earlier. But the diagnosis would age better than the prescription, which is honestly the standard outcome for almost every political manifesto ever written, fringe or mainstream. Marx nailed several diagnoses and flunked the prescription. So did most of the people who wrote actual constitutions that are still in force today, several of which still contain clauses nobody has the nerve to repeal because repealing them would mean admitting the original draft was written by people just as confused as Ghost Liberty, just with better lawyers. Alternatively, and this is the ending Pacifica's authors would hate most, the future stays boring. Institutions muddle through, badly, the way they always have, patched and repatched like everything else humans build under deadline pressure, and Pacifica just becomes what 99% of fringe political documents become: a footnote cited by people writing essays about internet ephemera, occasionally rediscovered by a bored forum user, permanently searchable, permanently unratified, permanently a little bit funny. That's not a tragic ending. That's most documents' actual ending, minus the ones lucky enough to get attached to a government with cannons. 7. What actually survives, and why nobody's proud of it. Strip away the sarcasm for one closing paragraph, because underneath the jokes there's a genuinely sharp point, and it deserves to land straight. Institutions are optimized to be correct in the present and are, structurally, terrible at being remembered accurately once their enforcement lapses. Their archives are vast, technical, and almost designed to bore future readers into ignoring them. Manifestos are optimized for exactly the opposite. They were never going to be enforced, so their authors wrote for posterity instead of compliance, reaching for Jefferson and eternity and immortal freedom of will, because nothing was stopping them from reaching that far. That's not a flaw unique to Pacifica. It's the general shape of every text that failed to seize power but succeeded at being interesting. The ratified constitutions get obeyed. The unratified ones get remembered, sometimes fondly, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes, as here, as a little of both, with a healthy dose of "did they really name themselves Nightslayer?" thrown in for good measure. Neither fate is obviously better. Both are just different ways of refusing to disappear.